All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking Psalm 69. Now, you might think ancient poetry doesn't have much to say about modern life, but we're about to look at a piece of literature that is absolutely stunning, both structurally brilliant and, honestly, emotionally devastating. It's literally a map of human suffering and recovery. And as you'll see, it's just as relevant to how we process our own mental health today as it was thousands of years ago. The author, David, he doesn't just ease us into things here. He hooks us right from the start with this desperate plea. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I mean, just think about that visceral, terrifying feeling of not being able to touch the bottom, right? The water rising over your chest, creeping up to your throat. David is using this intense physical metaphor of drowning to express a total psychological crisis. He is entirely overwhelmed. So, to really wrap our heads around what's happening in this text, we need to view it through the lens of a specific literary tradition, the lament. Now, a lament isn't just venting or complaining. It's a highly structured, passionate expression of grief, sorrow, or even deep anger. And here's the fascinating part. Laments almost always follow this distinct U-shaped emotional arc. Basically, they trace a deliberate, psychological journey downward into the absolute depths of despair before finally rising back up toward hope and praise. It's like an emotional roller coaster, but with a very specific purpose. Which brings us to Section 1, Sinking in Deep Waters, the Claustrophobia of Despair. Let's track that downward journey. When you read through these opening lines, you can almost feel the air leaving the room. The pacing is super heavy, the imagery is tight, and the panic, it hits you immediately. Right at the top, the superscription attributes this to David, and right away in verses 1 and 2, we take a total plunge into crisis. He talks about sinking in deep mire where there's no foothold. He says he's come into deep waters and the floods are sweeping over him. There is literally no solid ground left in his life. And look at how the text lists actual physical symptoms. We're talking about sinking without a foothold, the panic of sweeping floods, being totally weary from crying out, a completely parched throat, eyes growing dim from exhausted waiting. You know, this isn't just pretty poetic phrasing, this is an incredibly accurate description of a modern-day panic attack. It grounds the poetry entirely in the very real biology of human anxiety. Moving on to Section 2, Reproach and Isolation, the social cost of devotion. So, this crisis doesn't just stay in his head, it spills over into a brutal external reality of social betrayal. David spells out this profound isolation. He says he's become a stranger to his own brothers, an alien to his mother's sons. He's being mocked by the town leaders, and get this, he is the literal subject of drunkard songs. It's a complete social exile. And the ultimate irony here, it's his very devotion that caused it all. He explicitly points out that it's zeal for God's house that has consumed him. His religious fervor has ironically made him an absolute outcast in his own community. This social rejection hits its peak in verse 21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me sour wine to drink. Now, in the ancient Near East, offering food and drink was the absolute baseline of human decency and hospitality. So handing someone poison and sour wine, that is the ultimate betrayal of the social contract. And it's exactly this specific, cruel betrayal that triggers the crucial psychological pivot toward the author's intense anger. That brings us to Section 3, a plea for deliverance, the turning point. Having fully laid out his suffering, the author finally reaches a turning point. These next few verses act like a bridge connecting his crushing despair to his impending anger. Watch how he shifts his focus away from the people tormenting him and urgently begs for divine intervention. He's pleading with God to answer me, to hide not your face, and to draw near to my soul, redeem me. The urgency here is just palpable. He is essentially demanding that God step right into the mud with him. Listen closely to the phrasing in verse 14. Deliver me from sinking in the mire and from the deep waters. Notice how beautifully that loops right back to the very first drowning metaphors we looked at earlier. This isn't just someone rambling in pain. This is highly structured, deliberate literary framing. The author is actively organizing his chaos. Next up is Section 4, Punishment upon Punishment, the raw anger of imprecation. And that organized chaos leads us straight into what is definitely the most controversial section of the lament, the imprecation, or the cursing verses. Let's look at these with some objective empathy. He cries out, "Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually." Now, reading this neutrally, we have to see it as a visceral, deeply human reaction. Think about it. This is coming from a guy who has been mocked, isolated, and literally fed poison during his darkest hour. This isn't just blind malice. It's a raw, sharp cry for justice from someone totally broken by his community. He wants his enemies to feel the exact same physical terror and blindness that he's been suffering through. And the intensity just rapidly escalates from there. He says, "Pour out your indignation upon them and let your burning anger overtake them." He's not asking for a slap on the wrist here. He's demanding total divine retribution. He wants the universe itself to balance the scales of this immense suffering. Look at what he says next in verse 25. "May their camp be a desolation. Let no one dwell in their tents." The crucial thing to catch here is how perfectly this mirrors his own experience. Remember, he was made an alien to his mother's sons, completely shut out. Now, he's requesting total social erasure for his enemies. He wants their tents empty, just like they emptied his life of community. This rapid-fire sequence of anger hits its absolute climax in verse 28. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Let them not be enrolled among the righteous. I mean, that is the ultimate curse, total removal from existence. And if we look back at the architecture of our lament, this fierce, burning anger represents the absolute bottom of that U-shaped emotional arc. We have officially hit the floor. But then comes the ultimate hinge of this entire explainer. Verse 29. "But I am afflicted and in pain. Let your salvation, O God, set me on high." Just like that, the energy boldly shifts. The anger is spent. The plea is made. And suddenly the momentum powerfully thrusts upward. He's asking to be set on high, pulled out of those deep waters, pulled out of the mire. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Ascent to Praise, the U-shaped recovery. As we survive the deaths, we enter the final act of the poem. The claustrophobia finally breaks and there's breathing room again. Notice how the whole scope of the poem dramatically widens here. It moves away from the intensely personal pain of one guy drowning in mud and expands outward into this massive communal joy. He says, "Let heaven and earth praise him, the seas and everything that moves in them." He's literally enlisting the entire cosmos to join in on this recovery. And here's where we see that complete U-shaped transformation we've been tracking. On one side, look at verse 3. "My throat is parched, my eyes grow dim." Just total physical exhaustion and despair. But then, on the flip side in verse 30, "I will praise the name of God with a song." The throat that was completely parched, it's now singing. The spirit that was drowning is now magnifying God with thanksgiving. It's a total reversal. So, as we wrap up, let's look back at the full anatomy of this arc. We started by plunging into physical agony and deep despair. We endured the sting of isolation and profound betrayal. We hit rock bottom, expressing raw anger and crying out for justice. And finally, we ascended into triumphant hope and communal praise. This progression perfectly models the structure of a lament. It takes profound, chaotic tragedy and turns it into a highly organized engine for emotional release. Which leaves us with one final, pretty powerful thought to consider. When we look at the journey in Psalm 69, we have to ask, does giving a highly structured, unflinching voice to our darkest anger and deepest despair actually become the very vehicle that carries us back to hope? It kind of seems like by fully naming the darkness, David found the only real way back to the light. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and keep looking closely.